Hello, everyone. Welcome to our live stream, our Monticello live stream. My name is Kyle Chattleton. I'm one of the guides here at Monticello, and I'm joined by Lisa Francavilla. Lisa is the senior managing editor of the Jefferson Papers Retirement Series, and we're going to have a conversation today about some of Jefferson's letters and the work that you do and the research that you do. Thank you for joining us, however you're joining us, whether YouTube or Facebook or other channels. If you like to participate and ask questions to Lisa, feel free, excuse me, to do so by just writing in your question into the comments, and we'll try to get them to Lisa. But Lisa, why don't we just get our conversation going? Just tell us what is the work that you do?
Okay, so the retirement series focuses on Jefferson's years of retirement. So that starts in 1809 and goes through until his death in 1826. We might go a little bit after that. And what we're doing is we have collected and transcribed all of Jefferson's incoming and outgoing correspondence, and we're publishing that in volumes. And what we do as editors then is, besides the transcription, we provide a lot of annotation. So that is information that's helpful to the reader. So we explain to the reader what it is they're looking at, and we answer any questions that might arise if a reader is not familiar with everything that's in the content of the letter. So for example, if Jefferson writes, "I wrote a letter to Mr. M," we would explain, well, he means Mr. Madison, something like that. So, and we also kind of unpack in as concise a way some of the more complicated things that are going on in Jefferson's retirement. So for example, his unending and increasing financial battles as he approaches the end of his life. So that's what we do. There are Jefferson letters, literally thousands of Jefferson letters, and they span, of course, nearly the entirety of his life. The portion that we're focusing on, there's still probably about 15 or 16,000 letters that we're working on just for the retirement period, and they live in various places. So, for example, the bulk is probably at the Library of Congress, where there's almost 30,000 documents there. And then there's the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, which has a sizable collection, several thousand documents. And then there's, of course, also the University of Virginia, which is here in Charlottesville. And that has not only collections of Jefferson letters, but it also has lots of different collections of letters from Jefferson's extended family members. So his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, things like that. So we take all of these letters and we transcribe them and we present them to the reader. That's what we do.
It sounds like the easiest of tasks. Well, that all being said, how do you know what's out there, right? Where do you know to go for a letter, or do you know where everything is? I guess is another way to frame that question.
Well, we know where most things are. So Jefferson kept something called an epistolary record. We call it the Summary Journal of Letters. It's the SJL. And it looks kind of like this image that Melanie can throw at. But what it is this record that Jefferson kept almost the entirety of his life that shows all the letters on the left-hand side that Jefferson wrote and all of the letters on the right-hand side that Jefferson received. So it's kind of like a contents list for us. And it was very helpful because we knew what letters we should be looking for. And we can also tell when something's missing. But the great thing about the Summary Journal of Letters, now the SJL lives at the Library of Congress, so you can look at it yourself if you just go onto the Library of Congress's website and look for Jefferson's papers. But you can see, if you look at this particular page, you can see that Jefferson divides it up where, according to where he is. So for example, he draws a line where he's gone down to Poplar Forest, and then he draws another line when he's back at Monticello. So you can trace his travels that way. You can also use the Summary Journal of Letters to see when somebody's visiting Mr. Jefferson at Monticello, because a letter will not come through the mail to him, but it will be delivered by Mr. Johnson, for example. So that tells us that Mr. Johnson showed up at Monticello with some letters for Mr. Jefferson. And we can also see how long it took a letter to get to Mr. Jefferson. He was fascinated by how long it took mail to travel around the country. So he would always write the date the letter was written, and then he would write where it came from, and then he would write the date where it was received. So the Summary Journal of Letters tells us a lot about Jefferson, about his record keeping, and about the content of his mail, how long it took to get there. And it tells us various things about his life, but it was also instrumental for our work in creating a database of all the letters that are out there. So we know to use this to look for the documents at the Library of Congress, or at Massachusetts Historical Society, or at the Huntington out in California, or the Missouri Historical Society out in St. Louis. There are literally Jefferson letters living all over the world.
That's classic Jefferson.
Yeah.
That's just literally every bit of information that could be recorded, he records it in some way.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, as editors of Jefferson's papers, we're very lucky because we have that resource to draw from.
So do you ever find any new letters, like things that Jefferson didn't write down that he wrote? Just random new letters from Jefferson pop up from time to time?
Every once in a while, something new comes up. And Jefferson recorded most things in there. Every once in a while, a letter will turn up that isn't recorded in the Summary Journal of Letters. And if it's not recorded in the SJL, we will say so in our annotation to alert the reader to that. Often, though, what Jefferson didn't record is a little note that maybe he would send to a merchant down in Charlottesville, like James Leach, the Leach store. Or he would send a dinner invitation to a neighbor or a business associate in town. So what you're looking at now is one of those little notes. And these were literally really little scraps of paper. And if you want to show the next one, Melanie, you can see actually there are like little fold marks, because Jefferson would put this on a scrap of paper and he would fold it into a square that was probably about this big, and that it could be just tucked into probably a pocket of most likely an enslaved person that Jefferson was sending off on this little errand. So these little notes weren't recorded in the Summary Journal of Letters. And these are really interesting because they tell us what Jefferson is purchasing locally, and is quite a wide variety of things, you know, everything from iron to olive oil. So those are really interesting, but also the dinner invitations that I mentioned earlier. So Jefferson was routinely inviting people who lived in the neighborhood of Monticello or down in Charlottesville to come over for dinner, to meet a particular person, or just to hang out and enjoy the first dish of peas. And those, again, were little scraps of paper, and they were folded into little cubes and given to somebody to deliver. And those are not recorded in the Summary Journal of Letters, too. So when they pop up in the auction market, which is often the case, if we find them, they're a new document.
Nice. And so when you go to these auctions then and try to find these documents, is it just like an individual fragment that appears in the auction, or is it like a collection of things? You know, what does that auction process look like?
It varies. It depends on who's got the document. I don't spend a whole lot of time watching the auction houses. I would like to spend more time keeping an eye on them, because I've actually been able to track the sale and resale and then resale of individual Jefferson documents. Sometimes they are just single documents. Sometimes there are 2 or 3 documents. Sometimes they are sold individually, or they're in a frame with a nice little picture of Jefferson, just so you know what this guy looked like that wrote this little letter. And other times they're tipped into books. I've seen one of those Leach notes that I mentioned earlier actually tipped into the inside of a book that belonged to Bushrod, Washington. So did I say that right? Bushrod, Washington. That's what I meant to say. So they turn up in all kinds of different places. One of the other things, though, that I noticed when I look at these auction sites is sometimes people take these Jefferson documents and they piece them out in sometimes really alarming ways. So, for example, a few years ago, we acquired a nice digital image of a Jefferson letter with the attached address cover, and from an auctioneer, and then subsequently found that letter being auctioned off again by a different house, only they had separated the address cover, so they were selling it as 2 separate documents. So you lose the contents then. And so unless the same person bought the letter and the address cover, those things kind of go off in different directions. Even more disturbing, though, is I've seen instances where people have taken Jefferson documents and cut pieces out. So they've literally destroyed the document and framed that little word or a phrase or a whole strip. I have a couple of examples of those where you can see what's been marked out. And the thing that's sad is that the buyer gets that little strip of a Jefferson document. You can see it's marked out in red there, but then they don't know what the rest of the document about. This is a warrant that Jefferson filed in 1812 to try to settle a land dispute between him and a neighbor, and that little strip there is now being sold by somebody who doesn't really know what the rest of the document is about, because all they have is that little strip, so they're kind of guessing at it. But the thing that's great about this in particular document is that we managed to get this image from a previous auctioneer, and then we were able to transcribe it. So our work has value for two reasons now. We still have an image of the intact document, but we also have a transcription of the whole document as well, and it's freely accessible on Founders Online for anybody who's interested in Jefferson's very many land disputes, especially in his retirement period. So I'll stop talking about my disgust with that whole process.
It's funny, being a guide, not only are we, familiar with Jefferson's many disputes with his neighbors, but a lot of us use Founders Online to research letters or to see what Jefferson's thinking at a particular moment. And so I'm wondering, kind of what is the process then of kind of that interaction, right? So like, for example, you were talking about how sometimes letters just appear and there was no record of them. What is the process then of sharing that information online with sources like founders.gov?
Okay, so that happens sometimes. For example, if we find one of these like dinner invitations or a leaked document or some other document that we knew about but that may be lost track of, and if we've already printed the volume, published the volume that document would have belonged into. So say it's a document for 1814, and we've already published that volume that covers 1814. The beauty of publishing things digitally then as well is that we can go back in to the University of Virginia Press's Rotunda series, which is where the National Archives' Founders Online comes from. And we can add this document digitally. So it's not necessarily part of the print volume, but it's there in the digital volume. So, I mean, we want to disseminate this material as much as we can and as easily as we can for people. So this is one of the great things about it, is we can now publish this digitally. Even it's not like, oh, darn it, we'll have to do some sort of print supplement later, which we are going to do anyway, but we can do it now, and you don't have to wait, another 10 years before you see that document.
So we've been very kind of Jefferson centered. Are you only looking at Jefferson's letters when you do your research, or are you looking elsewhere as well for kind of this retirement series?
One of the things we really love to look at is Jefferson's family correspondence. And what I mean by that is letters that were written to and between his grandchildren. So they're talking to each other about life with Grandpapa, life at Monticello, life at Poplar Forest. They're talking about who's visiting Monticello, whether or not those visitors were enjoyable company or a pain in the neck. And they're talking about what the enslaved people are doing and social life, the economy. They're also talking about politics or whatever it is they're reading at that time. And they read a lot of novels, but they also read a lot of history books, things like that. So
we've kind of gotten to the end of our set questions, and in a moment we'll take questions from folks who are submitting them online. So do send us those questions if you haven't already. But I'll, in the meantime, ask a personal questions. Do you have a favorite letter from the research that you do, or a favorite kind of letter that you really enjoy looking at?
Well, I have two favorite things. The first thing I'm going to talk about goes back to this idea of documents that we discover or rediscover. So one of the things that, and this also ties in with the family letters too. So a while back, I contacted Cornell University because I was looking for letters that Jefferson's grandson-in-law, Nicholas Trist, had written to General Lafayette. And they had a couple there. that I was interested in, and I requested digital images of this document and got the digital images back from Cornell, and I'm thumbing through the images and like, that's not Nicholas Trist's handwriting, that's Thomas Jefferson's handwriting. And what it ended up being was a document that had been thought lost since the 1920s. And this was what came to be known as the Bradshaw epitaph. And we have an image of that as well. And Jefferson had copied this thing out, and he said it was in the hand of Ben Franklin. We don't know if that means that Ben Franklin actually wrote the epitaph or if it was something that Franklin had held out to Jefferson. We don't know what Jefferson meant by that. But this document is where we get the phrase, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. And this is a phrase that became solidly and firmly and irrevocably attached to Thomas Jefferson almost the entirety of his life from thereafter. He's in his early 30s when he sees this document. And this was stuck into the middle of a Nicholas Trist letter to General Lafayette. And this gets to some of the dissemination of Jefferson's documents after his death. Jefferson's family members were okay with dispersing some of Jefferson's documents if they didn't have his signature on them. And this is one of the things that they gave away, this letter. And so I was astonished when I found this in the middle of this Nicholas Trist letter, because there was at that time no indication in the finding aid at Cornell that they had this. So it was quite delightful and it was a joy. So that's one of my favorite things. So that means that there may be still other things like this hiding out there. You got to recognize Jefferson's handwriting. Fortunately, it's pretty distinctive. My other favorite things are, it's not just a single letter, but it's more like a series of letters. So Jefferson in his later years was really big on giving advice to young people in growing up. And a lot of times they were asking for this advice. So they were like, what kind of books should I be reading? What's your advice for a living? What's your advice for exercise? What's your advice for diet? Things like that. So Jefferson would kind of regurgitate all these ideas about you should read widely and you should read these kinds of books, and you should behave this way. You should conduct yourself this way. Be honest, be hardworking, be active always, be intellectually and physically active always. These were really important to him. And he had these expectations for people, for himself rather, for personal conduct and intellectual engagement, and he disseminated that as widely. And anytime somebody asked him about it, he was really anxious to share that information. So I kind of like those because they're ideals to aspire to. And we can argue about whether or not Jefferson met his own ideals at another time, but I think it's nice to always have these ideas that these are things to aspire to.
Related to something you just said, so you were talking about finding a letter and knowing it was Jefferson's because it's in Jefferson's hand.
Right.
Chester is wondering, have there been any issues with forgeries, like a letter that you find that's or that the community has widely understood to be authentic, and then you realize actually maybe this is not the letter we thought it was?
Oh my gosh, that's a really great question, Chester. I am not the person, unfortunately, who's had a lot of experience dealing with forgeries, but I know it's come up. And I think there was somebody, gosh, I would have to really research this. I think there was somebody back in the 90s who was doing this, but it's not something I'm really familiar with. I wouldn't want to speak too much about the details. The person you'd want to talk to is somebody who's up at our sister project at Princeton. So you would want to talk to the Papers of Thomas Jefferson up there. And I think one of their former editors has been, questioned about forgeries before. But that's, like I said, it's before my time. I've been with the retirement series for more than 20 years, and it predates me. So.
Getting back to a personal question. So we have these then two kind of series working towards the same goal, right? Publishing all these letters.
And getting done while some of us are still
alive.
I
was just going to say, how's it going?
Our series is going, we're just chucking along. We set out very ambitiously to publish a volume a year, to submit and also put out a volume a year. And we've managed to do that for as long as I've been here, since volume 1. So right now we are working on, let's see, we're in page proofs. We just finished page proofs for volume 20, and we are putting together volume 21, which will be submitted to Princeton University Press in December. And we've already started preliminary work on volume 22. We will have 24 volumes total. So you can see we're trucking right along, and we're right on track. And yeah, I will still, God willing, still be around until the series is gone.
Bruce was wondering how is it that we have all these copies of Jefferson's letters, right? We have a letter, and then we also have a copy of a letter. How did that all come to be?
Well, many of us have talked about how Jefferson always had this great sense of himself in terms of the history of our country. And because he thought like a lawyer as well, he knew it was important to keep everything. So there's what we call now a polygraph copy, but before that he was using other devices to make copies of any correspondence that he sent out. So we have what's called the recipient copy, and that would be the copy that Jefferson intended to send away, but then there was these retained copies that he kept for his files. And on the back of each of these letters, he would put a little endorsement. So he would write in the upper corner who he wrote the letter to and the date that he wrote it. And then he would file them in these little file boxes so that he could go back and look for that letter if he was ever questioned about something. And we know that he did that because we've seen other letters where he'll say, oh, in my letter to you of such and such date, you'll recall that I said, and then he'll quote himself. So we know that he filed them this way, so he could kind of go through the corners without having to pull out a stack. He could just look through the corners to find the letter that he meant. So this is how we have these copies, because Jefferson knew about the importance of keeping good records and being able to go back to things and not just rely on memory. And then I think he also knew that someday somebody would want to be looking at these letters. And this gets back to, all the documents and where they ended up. So, there was a huge chunk of them that were sold to the Library of Congress in 1848 by Jefferson's grandson-in-law, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, who was also the executor of his will. So there was, I don't even know how many thousands went to the Library of Congress. And then, incidentally, some of those more personal letters and documents were then returned to the family later when Jeff Randolph went back and said, oh, some of this stuff's not going to be interesting to anybody else, so why don't you give it back to us? And then that stuff stayed with the family, with things like the farm book and the garden book, which is where we get a lot of our information about Jefferson's enslaved people and about the crops that he's planting or he's having planted in the garden and the work that's being done by the enslaved people. So those things ended up at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And the reason that happened was because after the Civil War, the family in Virginia was quite impoverished. They literally lost everything. Jeff Randolph, who was in the last years of his life, had no resources to draw on. He'd invested heavily in Confederate bonds. And then, of course, they were worthless at the end of the war. And so when he passes away, one of his daughters sells all these documents to one of her cousins, Thomas Jefferson Coolidge, who was from Boston. And then he takes all these documents and these books and things of Jefferson's, and he takes them and gives them to the Massachusetts Historical Society. So that's how those ended up there. And then various family members continued to give things to the Massachusetts Historical Society. To the Library of Congress, not as much, but the University of Virginia is still getting collections pretty routinely from various people who are descendants or related to descendants, but not direct descendants themselves, things like that. So, yeah, does that? Yeah, no, I feel like I went a little off course.
It's all very fascinating. And speaking of these family connections, Natalia's wondering, is there a particular family member that you see Jefferson writing a lot to, or dare I say, is there a favorite grandchild of Thomas Jefferson's?
Yeah,
can we get that as well?
Everybody always says that Jefferson's favorite grandchildren, because I don't think he had just one. He was quite fond of Jeff Randolph, and he relied on him tremendously throughout the last years of his life. As you know, Thomas Jefferson Randolph took over the running of Jefferson's farms and estates in the 18-teens, and basically was running interference with Jefferson's creditors a lot of times, and trying to negotiate different things for Jefferson on his behalf. Other people would also say that Ellen Randolph Coolidge, the mother of Thomas Jefferson Coolidge, who bought those documents and then took them to Boston later in life, that Ellen was Jefferson's favorite grandchild. So yeah, I guess it depends on what you're interested in. But Jeff Randolph was not big on writing letters, was not a big deep thinker. Ellen was big on writing letters, wrote prolifically. And she was a big, deep thinker and liked to talk about a lot of different things and was very well read and had a lot to say and shared a lot of ideas with her grandpapa. So I guess maybe in terms of business, it would be Jeff Randolph. And in terms of the intellect, it would be Ellen.
Yeah, I think a lot of us guides kind of get that same sense from just reading the letters, you know. I saw a comment earlier, and I definitely should have clarified this as well when we were talking about the copies, right? And you mentioned the polygraph. If you ever visit Monticello, if you go to the library, you will find just off the library his cabinet or his kind of private office, and on the table there is essentially a copy machine. It's a device with 2 pens. They're connected by metal. As you write with 1 pen, it makes a replica on the other side,
makes an exact copy.
Which for the lawyer Jefferson, you know, wanting to keep meticulous records, that's a pretty wonderful tool at his disposal.
It is, but the thing about the polygraph though is, so he would send this copy off, or the recipient's copy off to the person he was writing to, and then he might go later and make a little notation on his polygraph copy, his retained copy. So he would make a little notation about something that he wanted to remember with regard to a particular piece of the content of the letter, or he would change the spelling of something, but he almost never changed the actual content as a whole. He might sometimes, if the polygraph didn't function quite properly, he might overwrite something, so he would darken it because the polygraph copy would skip a little. This gets to something else that Jefferson did later in life, because he's so mindful about money. He would get letters written to him, and if the address cover, which was the piece of paper that was folded over the letter and addressed, he would separate that address cover if it was blank on one side, and he would use that to make his retained polygraph copies. So that's why if you look at one of these original manuscripts, like at the Library of Congress, and you'll see this Jefferson's retained polygraph copy on one side, and then it's addressed to him on the other side, and that can be really confusing unless you know why that is. So he was trying to be frugal.
Well, I think this has been a wonderful conversation, Lisa, and we're very thankful to have you not only here with us right now, but thankful for all the work that you and the rest of your colleagues do over at the Papers. Thank you for joining us today. I appreciate you.
It was a lot of fun.
And thank you for joining us as well. Appreciate everybody who tuned in, asked us questions, and participated. Hope everybody has a great Independence weekend upcoming. And thanks again for stopping by.